Welcome to the interview of Professor Ruth Colker. I'm Marie Falinger from Hamline Law School, and this is the AALS section on Women in Legal Education Oral History Project. We're here today on January 4th, 2015 at the Marriott Boardman Park in Washington, D.C. So Ruth, if I may call you Ruth.
Absolutely.
Tell us a little bit about your growing up. Where were you born and what was your family like?
I was the third of 4 children. There's 5 years between my oldest brother and my little sister, so we were pretty closely spaced. 2 boys and 2 girls. I was the oldest girl. My mother always said that she had 4 only children because they wanted to treat each one of us as unique people. And I lived in Pittsburgh, in a suburb of Pittsburgh, and was a feminist from probably the day I was born. With 2 older brothers, I always wanted to do whatever they could do. And when I was 4, I told my mother that I wanted to be able to take my shirt off because my brothers could in the summer. And she, of course, didn't like that idea. And I wanted to play sports in Little League, and of course I couldn't do all those things. And at one time she had me talk to the woman up the street who was very athletic to have her tell me that it was great to be a girl and I should be very happy to be a girl. I didn't mind being a girl, I just wanted to do some of the things the boys were doing. But my parents were very supportive. When I was in high school, my father bought me Our Bodies, Ourselves, and my mother took me to hear Betty Friedan when I was in high school. So there was tension in the family about my feminism and my wanting to do what my brothers did, but my parents were also very supportive. I loved math and science, and I got a lot of support to do math and science, although in those days, there was a lot of sex segregation in school, and you had to push if you wanted to sometimes take courses that weren't expected to be the courses for girls. You know, we took home ec, and my brothers took mechanical drawing. So, you know, there were some real differences. But it's a very close-knit Jewish family in Pittsburgh, and with 2 very strong parents who helped me blossom, I think, as a leader from a young age.
So did your parents work outside the home?
My father was an engineer and eventually became more of a businessman. My mother was trained as a professional artist, and she stayed home when we were young. My little sister had some physical problems that made it hard for my mother to be out of the home. And then when my sister got a little older, my mother started working as an art teacher, and she worked as an art teacher until my little sister graduated from high school and went to college, and then she got a job for the Pittsburgh Pirates doing PR. She always loved the Pirates. The Pirates made her a feminist because my mother, I'm 5'8", my mother was a little taller than I am, and they would give the men jackets to wear with the pirate insignia, but she was not given a jacket, and they said they didn't have any in her size, and she said, well, no, actually, I can fit into a man's small. And she eventually left the Pirates, and I think it was good for our relationship for her to face some overt sex discrimination, because I think it helped her understand a lot of the issues that I was pushing.
Okay, you were interested in sports. Were you able to, was it because you were a girl they didn't let you on teams, or you're just discouraged? Or?
Well, so when I was little, I loved baseball. My family loved baseball. We were real baseball fans, especially my mother, not so much my father. And so I used to play baseball with the kids in the neighborhood. And then in 3rd grade or so, the boys went off to play Little League, and of course, I couldn't play Little League. And I drew a little target on the back of our house, and I would throw a baseball. I wanted to be a pitcher. I had no one to pitch to. I wanted to be a pitcher, so I would just spend what I perceive as hours a day, was probably 20 minutes, but you know, throwing a ball. But I had no opportunities to play. They didn't have softball yet for girls then. Eventually they formed a softball team when I was about 13, and my birthday was in May, my mother's birthday was in July, and the age cutoff for the team was like July 1st. And if I would have been honest about my birthday, it's the only time in my life I've overtly lied, but that I can recall or would admit. But I missed the cutoff by a couple of months, so I lied and said I had my mother's birthday so I could play softball because I had wanted to do this so badly. So I got to play softball a little bit in junior high school and high school. And that was my real love, to be a softball pitcher. And
This is girls softball, right?
Absolutely, girls softball. Started out with slow pitch, girls softball, and then in high school we moved on to fast pitch, and that's where I got my first introduction into feminist activism, which I can tell you about.
Okay, well, go ahead.
Well, so I was a junior in high school when they finally formed a girls softball team at my high school, and I was really excited about that. And of course, I went out for pitcher, and I was the pitcher for the team. I was the only one willing to stand up there and throw the ball and see what happens. We were a terrible team. We never won a game, but we had fun, and it was just great to play. And we had nothing. We had no balls, no shoes, no helmets. You know, we paid for everything. I think they gave us a T-shirt and no shoes. And we had no field that was ours. And we used to walk over to the boys' little league field where we would play. And my memory, which may be faulty, but I'll call it mine, is that I was out pitching one day and we were, I'm sure, losing by some terrible score. And all of a sudden they called the game because the boys' little league had the field at 6 o'clock to practice. And we had to leave the field. And I was like, this is wrong. I mean, this is just wrong. I had brothers. I knew that boys had many more opportunities in sports. And so I formed a group in my high school called the Feminist Humanist Club. I figured that we needed men as allies, so I shouldn't just call it the Feminist Club. And I had some male friends who agreed with me that this was wrong. So we formed the Feminist Humanist Club, and our project was to try to advocate for more funding in girls' sports. Somehow we found the name of an ACLU lawyer. We took the streetcar downtown and we visited with this lawyer who told us about Title IX that had been passed and that this shouldn't be happening. And then we went door to door to get signatures from parents to say, I'm in favor of equality in financial opportunities in sports for girls and boys. And I had my little letter jacket with my letter from softball, and I went with one of my male friends who had his own letter jacket, and we would walk around. Everyone thought we were so terribly cute. And we got all these signatures. And then I testified before the local school board to ask for $20,000 more funding in girls' sports. I had gone to the library, and I had found that they had the budget at the library, and that our funding, not surprisingly, was way below that of the boys. I thought $20,000 was a reasonable amount of money to ask for. I don't know what the discrepancy was. So I went and I testified. My parents came, and they knew at that moment I would become a lawyer. So I testified, and the school board voted to grant my request to do $20,000 more funding. I think they probably realized they were blatantly in violation of the law. That probably didn't hurt. So by then I was attending some National Organization for Women meetings. They had a chapter near where I lived, and they heard about my testimony, and they asked if I would please testify before the State Board of Education in Harrisburg. So I then got a ride with some people, slept on someone's living room floor in Harrisburg, and got up the next morning and gave a speech before the Pennsylvania Board of Education about the need for equality and athletic opportunities for boys and girls. And then the National Organization for Women had something they called Now Press, KNOW Press. And they asked me if they could please publish my testimony through their press. So I gave them permission. I must have been 17 or 18 at the time. I gave them permission, and they never sent me a copy of this thing. At some point I was reading something and I saw it advertised this publication, so I sent my dime to KNOW Press to get a copy of my publication. I didn't know about copyright, right? So I got a copy, and then a couple decades later, I got some kind of a communication from Duke University that they were archiving some material, and they wanted to archive my KNOW Press article. So it's sitting in the Duke Women's University archives. But that was a real thrill to be published.
Your first success, too. Your first big success.
Yeah, and I think that that's very much, that was a great way to start, right? I mean, I had faced overt discrimination, I had fought it, and I had succeeded, and I think I've always been an optimist, but I think it makes you an optimist, right, to have success at such a young age. It's very transformative, I'm sure. It made me always want to try to achieve change when I saw something that I thought was wrong.
Other things that were important to you during the high school years?
Well, I had a real passion for math. I really wanted to be a mathematician. I wanted to major in math in college, and I can talk a little bit about what that meant. But I was involved in some activities, and I had a great group of friends. But I don't think anything else was as strikingly important for me.
So, what did math mean to you?
Well,
why was it important?
I just loved math. I still love math. I still love computation. When I was in second grade, we played some little game in class where the teacher would put up flashcards and you would walk around the room and try to say the answer as quickly as possible. And I was so fast, I wasn't allowed to play the game. I would have to run the game or something. And then when I was in 12th grade, I remember taking the AP Calculus test, and it was a 3-hour exam, and I was done in an hour and a half, and you couldn't leave the room till 2 hours passed. So I did the exam over again. I took a second blue book and said, if you want to see another way to do these problems, read this blue book. And my teacher was like, what are you doing? And I remember another time, I was taking algebra, but I already had done really well in the state algebra contest, but I still had to take the whole course. And so I would turn in my paper and I put in the top, I have 100, you don't have to bother to grade it. And my teacher would write, thank you. I mean, it's very obnoxious, but I also think I was just very bored. And so that was my way of entertaining myself. But I just always loved computation. I just like basic math. I liked addition, multiplication, division, subtraction. I don't know why, it just has always appealed to me. I don't like the fancy stuff so much.
Do you think it has any relevance to your work as a lawyer or not?
Well, I do a lot of empirical work, yeah. And I love the nitty-gritty. Should we take a...
We were talking about how math has influenced your career. You're talking about your empirical research.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the articles that I've written that was most cited was an article in which I documented how poorly plaintiffs were doing in cases brought under the Americans with Disabilities Act. And I was just talking to Kai Feldblum yesterday, who helped get the ADA through Congress, and she was introducing me to a senator, and said to him, well, you know, remember Ruth's article that we used so much when we were trying to get the ADA amended in 2008. So my love for data actually has influenced some of the empirical work I've done as a scholar, and I think it also is part of what makes my mind love nitty-gritty details. You know, but a lot of people hate math and are great lawyers and law professors. So, but I do think I have a very mathematical way of approaching the world. I don't know why. I just love numbers.
So how'd you go pick college?
Oh, that was, well, so I was the third of 4 children. They were very closely spaced. So I have a brother 3 years older than me and 2 years older than me. So when I was about in 9th grade, my mother bought some college books for my brother, who was a senior, to start looking, at college books. And so one of the things I always used to do growing up is whatever my brothers did, I would watch it or imitate it. So if my brother was taking violin lessons, I would sit and listen to his violin lessons. I mean, I don't know why, I'm just that kind of person. Or if he was doing math, I would borrow his math book and try to learn the math myself. So when this college book is on the coffee table, of course I'm going to open it and read it from cover to cover, even if he isn't, right? So I'm sitting there reading this books, and both my parents did go to university, both went to a university in Pittsburgh where we lived, and weren't that familiar with universities, outside of Pittsburgh. But very supportive of us having an opportunity to go to a national university. So I'm sitting there reading, and I said to my mother, have you heard of Radcliffe? That sounds like a good place. And she said, yeah, that's a good place. And I really liked, at least what the book said, that they had this tutorial program, and I thought I'd really enjoy working with someone one-to-one. So I had the previous summer had gone to an NSF program on physics at Cornell University, because I also love science, and physics is very mathematical, so I especially love physics. So I had made a good friend, Kelly Pan, when I went there, and Kelly was interested in looking at colleges too. So I took a bus up to New York City and met Kelly in Manhattan, and then we took a bus to Princeton, Yale, Harvard, and MIT to look at colleges together. And I first went to Princeton and didn't really like it. It seemed too plasticky and too upper class for my taste. And then I went to Yale, and I didn't like my interviewer there. And then I went to Harvard, or Radcliffe in those days. At those days, you'd be admitted to Radcliffe, and by virtue of being admitted to Radcliffe, you're admitted to Harvard University. So this older African-American woman interviewed me, and she just made me feel like the most important person on this planet. And I was like, I want to go here. This is such a vibrant, exciting place. And so fortunately they accepted me, and that's where I went. And looking back, it's interesting, my high school didn't hold against me all the advocacy I had been doing. I complained about a bunch of things, not just inequities in girls and boys sports. And I think back to young people when I talk to them sometimes, like, oh, I don't know if I do this, someone might hold against me, and I'm like, just be yourself, it's fine. Would I want to go to a college that doesn't want someone like me? I wanted them to know who I was. I was very clear about who I was when I wrote my college application. And I have no idea how that application was received. I have no idea what my guidance counselor said about me. Did they recommend me despite the trouble I was getting into, or because of the trouble I was getting into? I'll never know the answer to that. And I actually wish, I don't even know who my guidance counselor was, but I would love to know what the perception was of me at the time. I was first in my class, I had good test scores and all that stuff, but what about that part of me that was a feminist, that was an activist? Was that a plus or not? I graduated from high school in '74, so it was unusual, right, to take those views in those days.
So what about your life at Radcliffe? Any mentors there, women mentors for you? Were they mostly women faculty at that point, or?
Well, when you're admitted to Radcliffe University, you're admitted to Harvard University, and all your classes are Harvard classes.
Okay.
Yeah, and so so I got to Harvard, Radcliffe, whatever you want to call it, in '74. There wasn't a women's studies major at that time at Harvard. I took a women's studies class my freshman year and decided I wanted to major in women's studies. I also took a math class that was taught by the chair of the department, who was very sexist and hostile, and decided I didn't want to major in math, which was such a shock because I was going to major in math. I mean, there was no doubt about that. But after being the only woman in the class both semesters and him treating me with such hostility and knowing he was the chairman of the department, what are you going to do? I mean, there's no way I was going to major in math. And when a former president of Harvard University made some statement a number of years ago about how hard it is to hire women, in math and science, I wrote him a letter and said, you're to blame for that. I would have been available as a math academic if those professors hadn't been so hostile to us. So don't blame us. Take some responsibility here. But he didn't respond. People never respond to my letters for some reason. But anyway, so I took a women's studies course my freshman year. And the TA was Susan Ware, who I'm still in touch with a little bit. She's at the Schlesinger, well, she has worked a number of places. She's an independent historian who's worked a bit at the Schlesinger Library. And anyway, I love my women's studies course, because I was reading about what I was doing. And so I asked to create an independent major in women's studies. And Harvard said that I couldn't because women's studies didn't have a methodology, and that you couldn't have an independent study in a subject without a methodology. So instead I majored in what was called social studies, which is an interdisciplinary major. And I worked closely with a woman named Kathy Whittam, who was in the psychology department. I actually co-authored a piece with her when I was a student. And then she was my thesis advisor, and my thesis was on feminist theory. And it didn't receive an entirely friendly reception. This is the story of my life. I do things and they're not always appreciated. So, when you write a thesis, you have two people who read it. So one person said that it was worth a Magna grade, and the other person said it was worth like a cum minus grade or something. I don't know how that, because the person didn't like my statistical empirical work. And of course I wrote my thesis based on a peer-reviewed article I had read that used that particular methodology, and I just borrowed it, and it was good enough for this well-established peer-reviewed journal, but apparently not good enough for a senior's thesis in college, right? I mean, remember, I wasn't a doctoral thesis, right? So the rule at Harvard was that if there was a discrepancy of more than one grade between the two reviewers, they'd bring in a third reviewer. And also I went in and complained about it because I thought that was unfair. Maybe I complained later, I'm not sure. Anyway, so they brought in a third reviewer. Oh, and my department, my social studies department, wasn't able to give me a thesis advisor because they didn't have anybody qualified to be my thesis advisor, so I had to go outside of the department to get someone in psychology to advise my thesis. So I was a little bit disadvantaged, I think, in that sense. So they bring in a third reviewer, I think from like the statistics department, who gives me a non-honors grade. I was furious. And he started his review by saying that he began reading this by thinking that feminist theory wasn't worthy of a thesis and ended still believing that. Well, that sounds like a really objective reviewer. So at that point I went in and complained, as one might, to someone in my department. I'd had very little interaction with my department, as it turned out, until then. And so the person said, look, you're admitted to Harvard Law School. What are you complaining about? But it was the difference between me graduating cum laude and magna. And I cared, but of course, my transcript will always say I graduated cum laude because I did. One exciting thing for me, though, was that I went to Harvard Law School, and when I was in my first or second year of Harvard Law School, Harvard created a women's studies major, and one of the things they did is they created a library of women's studies dissertations or theses or whatever, and they put my thesis in the women's studies library. Hopefully it's still sitting there. And that made me feel a little vindicated that finally, yes, women's studies does have a methodology, and my work actually was good, and it, maybe it's belated, but I got some recognition, but I never got an apology. I think if they want to send me one, I would still accept it, because I think I wasn't treated fairly.
Yeah. Did you do some other things while you were in college at Harvard, besides working on?
I did so many things. Well, I became very active in gay rights issues, especially, especially among lesbians. At that time, there's a lot of tension between gay men and lesbians, and so mostly I helped start a lesbian group, and I became very active in those kind of issues. I also became president of the Radcliffe Student Government and sat on the Radcliffe Board of Trustees. And I rowed crew, and I was captain of the crew team, and I went to nationals and had some success in rowing in crew. So I was sort of a busy person.
What got you to the gay rights area?
I realized I was attracted to women, and that wasn't something I had thought about in high school. And so it was sort of exciting, right, to meet like these other women who had the same views that I did. And there was so much blatant discrimination, it's just even hard to imagine today.
Any examples of what you remember from that?
Well, if you're out with another woman and you're walking closely, people would say things and threaten to do physical harm to you. So it was often scary, physically scary. I never had anybody try to beat me up, but I certainly had people say that that's what they wanted to do. And I continued to do gay rights work in law school. I can talk about it in a few minutes, but in those days, a lot of it was just trying to create a safe space for ourselves, because it was just a very scary time to be out and to be gay, and we didn't feel comfortable with gay men, and so we were a very insular group, and a lot of us were on the crew team, and there was some tension within the crew team between the straight and the lesbian women, and there was some tension with some of the coaching staff. I remember one of my best friends, Barbara Norris, was applying to be a Rhodes Scholar, and she wanted the crew coach to write a recommendation for her, and he refused, and it was because she was a lesbian. So you just had to expect that you didn't know when that would happen. I applied to be a Rhodes Scholar, and I wasn't selected. I was the second year a woman was eligible to apply to be a Rhodes Scholar, and I was captain of the crew team. I was president of the student body. I was a really good student. I did a lot of political activism. I don't know, I seemed like a pretty good candidate, and I made it quite far in the selection process, but I wasn't chosen, and I don't know if they figured out I was a lesbian. I mean, I can imagine that if they had, they would not have been pleased. So you never know why people do what they do. There was an award to the best student athlete that was given at graduation. I didn't get it. It made no sense. As president of the student body, as captain of my team, we were the best team at Radcliffe. We went to nationals. I personally was fourth in the nation in a single scull. And the person that they gave it to was a wonderful person who was a closeted lesbian. It came out later, and so it was sort of ironic that they still ended up giving it to a lesbian, but they didn't know that. But that was normal. You expected that. It didn't ever stop me, but it was normal.
Was most of your work, gay rights work, about the institution, or was it external when you were in college?
In college, I guess it was mostly about the institution itself. I testified before the Harvard Board of Overseers asking them to adopt a non-discrimination policy, and it was a really memorable experience. So I testified that this would be an important and appropriate step for them to take. I can't remember if I was a senior in college then or a first-year law student, because those times in my life blend together. And it was a very hostile reaction. But I still remember there was this one older man with a German accent who said that he was a Holocaust survivor and that they should listen to me, that Hitler had, of course, also hated the gays as well as the Jews. And of course, I was also Jewish. And that this is a very important issue and that they should take it seriously. But the hostility in the room, you could cut it with a knife. But several years later, after I graduated from law school, Harvard adopted a non-discrimination policy. So, you know, someone has to be first, someone has to ask first, someone has to be turned down, I suppose, so that there can be success later. But most of my activism in college probably had more to do with feminist issues than gay rights issues.
So what were you after as a feminist in college?
Well, we were, as president of the student government, I was very interested in what kind of healthcare choices women had. Would Harvard pay for abortions? You know, very interested in athletic funding. Was it equal? I mean, just to give you an example, you know, I rode crew in those days. At spring break, we would stay on campus to train because it's a spring sport. The women would stay. We would be housed in a dormitory. Wouldn't have to pay rent. They would give us some meals, just barely, and we would row twice a day. You know, at Harvard, the men go to California or Florida, fully paid trip. In the summer, they went to Henley. They would get to go to England, and you know, we were baking cookies, right? You know, and so it was just there was very blatant discrimination in athletics and pretty much everything you could imagine at that time. I graduated from college in '78, and so I'm sure Harvard's a very different place now. I would hope so, but. When I was at Harvard, they had a quota for how many women they would admit versus how many men. I think it was 2.5 to 1 or so. And my first year of law school or so, they went to sex-blind admissions, which is something that I, of course, pushed for. And they said, oh, it would take 20 years to move to 50-50, and it took like 2. Because first of all, it's harder to get in for women, and also if you know it's harder to get in, you're less likely to apply. But that was the atmosphere. It took a long time for alumni to realize that they had daughters as well as sons, and that they should be making these opportunities available to both their male and female children.
You know, going to law school seems kind of like a natural progression, but what made you decide that that's the career that you wanted?
Well, when I was in high school, I read William O. Douglas's autobiography, actually. And even though I wanted to major in math, I actually always knew I wanted to be a lawyer. I thought that math would be good training to study law. So I read his autobiography and just thought that law made sense for me as a way to achieve social change. Although it's funny, I remember when I applied to law school, I had to get some recommendations, and I went to one of my professors to ask for a recommendation, and she said, oh, I never thought of you going to law school. I was like, really? You know, because she thought a law school was very corporate, you know, and obviously that was not what I was there for. And so I explained why. And oh, okay, well, that makes more sense. And I'm sure she wrote me a strong letter. But I went to law school to change the world, and it made total sense that that's a set of skills that I would want.
Sure. So how was it at Harvard Law School when you got there?
It wasn't exactly what I had hoped for. You know, as much as college was a struggle, as part of a struggle, but there was this group of people who took women's studies classes, and I had the crew team, and the people I was around were very supportive. I mean, I was fighting the institution, but I wasn't fighting my fellow students. I met such interesting, diverse, wonderful people in college. It was a really positive time for me. I went to Harvard Law School because they admitted me 2 weeks after I applied, and so it became my safety school in a sense, but I didn't apply anywhere else. And I just had to cross the street. I could just stay, you know, living where I was. I had friends who were still in college. It seemed to make sense to just do that. And I didn't really think about Harvard, like what do they offer as a law school? I got to law school, it's 25% women, which means there's a woman, you know, there might be a woman to your right, a woman to your left, and everybody else is a man, right? All the faculty were male. They had one woman who taught oil and gas, who they brought out of the library to teach part-time because it was embarrassing to have no tenured women on the faculty. They just started to hire a couple of women, like Betsy Bartlett was hired when I was there. Martha Minnow was hired my last year in law school, although I never had a class with her. So to say it was male dominated, I mean, it was just male. I mean, there were just men everywhere. And the students were often very conservative. I hadn't known those kind of people so much in college. And the classes had nothing to do with what I came to law school to learn. Torts and contracts and property. I remember sitting there thinking, what's a contractor versus a contractee? You know, why is OR mean one thing and EE means the other? And I would sit there just writing notes to myself about the language, who's the plaintiff, who's the defendant. I didn't come from a family of lawyers. I hadn't done legal work. I didn't know the whole terminology. And none of the classes had anything to do with why I was in law school until the spring semester of my first year. At that time, you could elect one class, and constitutional law wasn't a required class in the first year, but you could elect it. And Martha Field was visiting from Penn, and I could actually have a class with a woman professor in constitutional law. I mean, what could be better? So I elected to take that class from Professor Field, and there were a bunch of us women who chose the class, probably all for the same reasons. We sat in the back of the room, and the class treated her so disrespectfully, I was just in shock. And one event I'll never forget is she asked a question and some man raised his hand and he said, if I would take you seriously, that's how he began his, and the women in the room, I'd never done this again in law school or up until that time, we just hissed immediately. We just let out like, what do you mean if I would take you seriously? She like clerked for the Supreme Court. She's like this brilliant scholar. So, but that unfortunately was, you know, part of what we were experiencing. I was on the Women's Law Journal from an early stage. We had our office. People would write graffiti on our office calling us dykes, and many of us were, but you don't still put that on the door, right? And we could say that about ourselves. No one else could say that to us, right? So it was just a very overtly hostile climate from some people, obviously not everyone.
Any supporters, any mentors, any people you felt safe with?
Well, at that time, no one on the regular faculty. Catherine MacKinnon visited, we had a January term then for like 3 weeks in January. Catherine MacKinnon visited for 3 weeks in January, and it was funny, I had really wanted to take a course on women's rights, sex discrimination. Harvard didn't have anyone at that time on the faculty who could teach such a course, so we bring in a visitor. So they brought in Leo Kanowitz the first semester of my third year of law school to teach the women in the law class, because he had written one of the first case books on sex discrimination. And so he taught the course from the perspective of men can be discriminated against also, which I found to be a rather boring way to think about the problem. And in fact, during his exam, which was all about a man who wanted to teach a women's study, a sex discrimination class, and the women had said he couldn't teach it because they wanted a woman. That was the exam. And like, I actually had to get up in the middle of the exam and leave and use the bathroom and practically throw up and come back and finish, because I couldn't say what he wanted to hear. I refused to get an A on his exam. I just would not walk down the path of saying it's the same thing. So I figured I'd just take my B+, but it was worth it to have integrity. But so I had taken his class in the fall. I hadn't been too thrilled with it. And then MacKinnon was going to visit in the spring and teach a sex discrimination class. I was like, oh my God, I've already taken it. So I went to the registrar and said, I really want to take this class from Catherine MacKinnon. And she says, well, if MacKinnon will write me a letter saying it's a different class than the one Leo Kanowitz taught, you can take it. So I wrote to MacKinnon and I told her the situation. So she wrote back this letter that says, you can believe this is going to be entirely different from any class that Leo Kanowitz taught. And so I was allowed to take the class. And I had also communicated with MacKinnon because I was reviewing her book on sexual harassment of working women, and I was an editor of the Women's Law Journal. And so the first class, she's like, who's Ruth Colker? I'm like, that's me. She goes, I want you to talk to you after class. So I stayed after class and talked to her, and we probably talked nonstop for the next 3 weeks, every second we could. And she was by far the most important person in my life at that time. It was the right.
Did you keep up with her after that?
I did for many years, not so much today, but she was just very supportive, and we had the same perspective on the world, and
Sure.
I had never met anybody who had a law degree who saw the world the way I did, so it was really exciting.
But though you did start the Women's Law Journal.
I didn't start it, no. I was an editor in, I think, volume 3.
Okay, how did that happen, do you know? I mean,
Well, what
given
happened?
that atmosphere, that seems
Right.
surprising.
So a couple years before I started law school, I believe there was Celebration 20, which means the 20th year women had attended Harvard Law School. That probably sounds about right, doesn't it? So they, as part of Celebration 20, they decided to have one issue of a women's law journal. And then after they had one issue, the editor said, well, we'd like to continue. And so it wasn't clear if they would be able to continue. There wasn't a commitment to continue. So I was an editor in volume 3, and we were told, if we did a good job and showed that we could publish, some decent stuff. We only came out once a year, that we would be allowed to continue. So, so it was part of Celebration 20. I think that's my recollection.
Yeah, so. Anything else during law school that was really influential on you later?
Well, during law school, I went to the Career Services office and said I wanted to do work in civil rights, and did they have any recommendations for me? And they had someone, I think, at the time who tried to advise students who wanted public interest careers. And so the advice he gave to me was find someone in your community who is doing the kind of work you want to do, offer to volunteer and make yourself indispensable, which I think is great advice. So I looked around and I said, well, the person in my community who would fit that description would be Nancy Gertner. So I just wrote Nancy Gertner a letter and just said, this is who I am. I would love to work with you if that would be possible. So she said, come on down. So I came on down and I interviewed with her, and she said, sure, I'd be happy to hire you. I said, no, I want to volunteer. I wasn't looking for a paid job. She goes, well, if you're doing work for me, I would want to pay you. I mean, it probably wasn't much money, but it was a nice gesture. So I worked for Gertner during my second and third years of law school, roughly, and it was, she's an amazing person, and it was really generous of her to take me under her wing, so I appreciated that. I also worked as a TA in the political science, I think it was the political science department, and it's like a women's studies class, and it was nice to be able to do some work in the classroom. And the Women's Law Journal was really great. There were 6 or 7 of us, and we worked really hard, and we put out a journal, and I think we were publishing work on really important issues that other journals weren't publishing at that time. And I really learned I learned the most working on the Women's Law Journal, because I had never really gotten feedback on my writing, and so I had a great editor when I was, I think, a 1L or a 2L, who was helping me work on my notes and gave me real feedback on the construction of a sentence in a paragraph. She had a PhD in English, and she happened to be my editor, and that's one nice thing about going to a law school with people so talented. So I think that's where I learned what I learned in law school, not in the classroom, except for MacKinnon, not in the classroom at all. I didn't go to many classes after my first year of law school. It just wasn't worth my time. I mean, I remember one class, I would go the first couple classes, see what the professor was doing. Usually they just read out loud from the book or something. I said, I can do that myself. I don't need someone to read out loud to me. The quality of teaching was really shameful. I'm sure it's improved. It only has one direction to go. Which wasn't a gender thing. It's just the professors didn't care about teaching, and they were too important to teach. So I would show up for the final. It didn't seem to affect my grades, whether I went to class.
Anything else about law school?
I ran 3 or 4 marathons, and nothing else too important I can think of.
So when you started looking for a job after law school, where did you look, and how did you decide on the job?
Well, so I wanted to be a civil rights lawyer, so it seemed to be the best thing to do. We worked for the United States Department of Justice in the Civil Rights Division. That seemed like an obvious place for me to want to work. So I applied through the honors program at DOJ. At the time, Carter was president. There was an election in which, of course, he lost re-election, and Reagan was elected. So I was interviewed by the outgoing Carter administration. They made their decision in December, so they knew that they were a lame duck administration, but they were the ones who got to make the choices. And I had just written an article on sexual harassment for my senior thesis, and I was lucky in that my interviewer was going to give a speech on sexual harassment. And she hadn't done much research yet, and that was the one topic I could talk about. I mean, the next room was the person from the Voting Rights Division. I didn't really know much about voting rights. I don't think it would have gone as well. So, you know, life is full of fortuities, and so I happened to be interviewed by someone who was really interested in the issues that I was interested in. I wasn't a great law student, so I didn't get there on the basis of my grades. I mean, I certainly got there because of my activism and my interest. And my, you know, I would have had good grades if they just taught courses that were interesting. But
So what was the atmosphere like for women at the DOJ at that point?
yeah, that was interesting.
Gay, lesbian people?
Yeah, it was all interesting, right? So, so I'd have a security clearance, and I didn't know how that was going to go. So at the time, my partner was a woman. I should say I'm actually bisexual, so I actually had male partners and female partners during this time. That was something I figured out in law school, that I was actually bisexual rather than a lesbian. But at the time, I had the job offer from DOJ. My partner was a woman, and so you had to fill out all the stuff about who they could interview and what you've done. And so I decided, I don't know if I got advice, but I just decided I should just be out, because they're going to figure it out anyway. And I didn't want to have them think I could be blackmailed, so I thought I should just be out. So my resume said I was president of the gay group, or whatever I was doing at the time. Yeah, I helped found the Committee on Gay and Lesbian Legal Issues at Harvard Law School, so that was sort of blatant, right? So, so I go through the security process, and I later got my security clearance file, so that's how I know what happened. So there's like some delays, everyone else is hearing and I'm not hearing, and it turns out that in the middle of this process, someone actually read my resume. You know, the FBI doesn't always do a great job. So in the middle of this process, someone reads my resume, and I see this telex. That's what they had in those days, telexes. This telex goes to one office to another that says, Colker says she's president of the Committee on Gay and Lesbian Legal Issues. She might be a lesbian. Go interview some men to find out if she can work with men. Because we know that all lesbians hate men and can't work with men, but heterosexuals, of course, don't have that problem, right? So, but I'm actually bisexual, so I had male partners, right? So I listed everywhere I lived. And so the way the FBI does their work is they knock on your door at 7 o'clock in the morning, because they always like to intimidate people. So they knock on the door of a former boyfriend of mine who lived in New Haven, where I was working one summer, 7 o'clock in the morning, to ask me if I hate men. And we had had a very amicable breakup. So they knock on the door, and he's like, oh, no, I don't think so. We seem to get along quite well. I don't think they figured out that I had been partners with him. So I passed the Don't Hate Men test. And then I also had disclosed that you have to do all your prior work. So I had tutored students in math when I was in high school, great, big surprise. But I didn't know the names of these students anymore, right? It had been a number of years. I'm not good with names anyway. So the FBI was like, oh, well, maybe she's a pedophile, and she's deliberately holding back the names of these young boys who she tutored in high school. And so they kept bothering me, like, give us some names, give us some names. Like, I just don't know the names. I can't give them to you. Like, so I gave them the name of my former high school math teacher, said you could talk to her. She's the one who got the name. She could probably confirm that this was legitimate. So I apparently passed the I'm not a pedophile test. So anyway, I eventually passed my security clearance, and I passed my security clearance, I believe, just because the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, who reviewed security clearances at that time, was comfortable with having an out lesbian at the Department of Justice. Had he not been comfortable, I could have been denied. I mean, that's their call, and it would have happened both ways in those days. I now know that, but I slipped through the cracks. And so came to DOJ in '81. There was a network at the Department of Justice of gay lawyers who sort of knew each other. You know, I'm sure that's still true today. There weren't a lot of women in the Civil Rights Division at the Department of Justice, surprisingly. No woman at a high level, no woman who was a GS-15 or above. And there was some pretty blatant sexual harassment, as one might expect in those days. So one of my supervisors tried to get most of the women to sleep with him. He didn't go after me. I think he thought I was off bounds, but he was married, of course. They always are. But I used to run to and from work and work out in the Department of Justice gym. I was running like 60 miles a week in those days, running a lot of marathons. And so I got out to the department gym. They had a gym, used to be the FBI's old gym, and I'd do some weightlifting. And he would get down there at 8 o'clock in the morning when I would get down there to watch me, to leer. And at first I was like, oh, it's sort of funny that he's like showing up at 8 o'clock in the morning. Then I found out that he had never been seen there at 8 o'clock in the morning. But, you know, that's just the way things were. I mean, I was respected and I had interesting work, and, you know, I think that actually the women in the department were well respected by our supervisors, other than maybe him. So I don't have any complaints in that sense, but it was just a different time. Mm-hmm. What was normal and acceptable was very different. Sexual harassment wasn't a cause of action at that time.
Any big successes while you were at DOJ?
Yeah, I mean, the nice thing about working in the Department of Justice is you win all your cases. It's a little different than my life since then. One interesting case, well, this shows how political DOJ is, but so Carter had obviously been president, he no longer was president. There had been a complaint filed against the state of Georgia, and the Department of Justice has sat on the case. And then when Reagan became president, they stopped sitting on the case, and the case lands on my desk, and we investigated, and we got a $2 million settlement against the state of Georgia for their race discrimination. They clearly were engaging in race discrimination, but it was an interesting lesson to me and the political nature of the way cases might be selected. I got to do a solo case on behalf of a Jewish firefighter who was discriminated against on the basis of his religion, and they would say things to him like, could you put the pizza in the ovens? Your people are good at that. And I never told him I was Jewish. I didn't feel comfortable sharing that. And I deposed his supervisor, who was making these wonderful comments. And I certainly didn't disclose to him that I was Jewish, but as obviously I was a woman. And during the deposition, he started swearing at me and like calling me names that I probably shouldn't say on this videograph. And his lawyer stopped the deposition and instructed him to, you know, be cooperative, and we settled the case the next day. Obviously, he wasn't going to make a good witness at trial. So it was a great experience in terms of the opportunities I had. The only problem was that Reagan was president and we were being expected to do reverse discrimination cases. I was never asked to do one, but my office mate was, and that was not a path that I could follow. I didn't go to the Civil Rights Division to represent white people who were victimized by race discrimination. So meantime, I was doing some adjunct teaching at GW in their Women's Studies department, and I was writing some feminist theory articles, and I had friends who were law professors like Christine Littleton who said to me, you know, Ruth, there's a job out there for people who do what you like to do, the teaching and the scholarship. Maybe you should try to become a law professor. And since I hated law school so much, I mean, I almost dropped out of law school because I hated it so much. It had nothing to do with who I was or wanted to be. I was like, what? And they're like, well, you know, they're hiring women to be law professors now. You might want to do that. So I went, so that's why, so when I left, so I decided to apply to be a law professor while still at DOJ, so I didn't have any gap in my employment, but that's what I ended up doing. But
why Tulane?
Oh, because they made me an offer. Yeah, I mean, I did the standard thing, right? I went to the national conference and interviewed with a bunch of schools, and I hadn't been a great law student. I didn't graduate with honors. You know, I did fine, but I didn't have any fancy clerkship. I didn't know any professors to ask to be references. I mean, I contacted a couple of professors, and there's no way they would have remembered me. I like barely showed up in their classes. I never did anything distinguished. They were polite and said nice things about me, but they probably had no idea who I was. But I was writing. I already had some published articles, and I had doing some teaching. And schools wanted women, and so there were a number of schools that had very few women on the faculty that expressed an interest in hiring me, and I was fortunate that Tulane was one of them because it was obviously a very good law school to have as my first job offer.
Why is that?
Well, they had money and resources and would let me teach the kinds of courses I wanted to teach. So it was, I mean, there was There were some issues. I had a female partner at the time, and I could share an interesting story about the job offer. You'd like to hear about?
Yeah.
Well, so, when you apply for a job, you interview with a number of people, including the dean. So I interview with the dean, and he looks at my resume, and he says, I see you do feminist theory, you do anything else? I'd worked at the Department of Justice, I'd been a trial lawyer there, I thought I could do some other things. So I explained to him what the other things I thought I could do. But he was the outgoing dean, so I wasn't terribly concerned about that. And so then, so I get a call from the chair of the appointments committee to say that the dean's gonna call me to make me an offer, and he hopes that I will accept it. So it was nice of him to give me the heads up. You're not supposed to do that, but it was nice of him to give me that heads up. So I said to him, his name was Joel Friedman, still is. I said to Joel, well, I really want to go down and visit. Joel knew I was a lesbian. I really want to go down and visit with my female partner. She has never been to New Orleans. I'm not going to go down there by myself. We both are going to go down. And Joel says, don't ask him to send both of you down. He'll just take it out of your salary, even if he pays for it. It's just not worth it. And I was like, I'm sorry, okay, thanks for the advice. I mean, it's reasonable advice, in good faith, totally reasonable. So I get the call from the dean, whose name I won't repeat for the sake of being too negative here. And so I said to him, well, my partner has never been to New Orleans, and I'd love for us both to go visit to see if this makes sense for us. I didn't use a pronoun. And he says, well, we only pay for partners who are married. I said, well, I'm sorry, but they won't let us get married. And I think at that point it dawned on him, unless this was my brother, right, that there was a reason why they won't let us get married. So he agreed that if I would try to get some ultra cheap airfare that they would pay. So we get some fare where we go through 5 cities and we stay with a faculty member, Catherine Hancock, who was always wonderful to me, and look around and asked Catherine to have us meet all the lesbians in the city, and I met the director of the ACLU, and it was great. We had a wonderful time, and I accepted the job offer. And then, of course, the dean told both of the men who'd been offered jobs, who were single and had no partner to bring with them, that they could have 1 free extra round-trip airplane ticket to New Orleans, and he also took it out of my salary. So 6 or 7 years later, I got a salary adjustment from Tulane when they reviewed all the women's salaries, and I had been discriminated against with respect to my salary. But that's just what happened.
That's what happened, yeah. So when you got there, after the dean left, how was it for women there?
We were very close-knit. We were very supportive with each other. Loyola Law School is across the street from Tulane. And so we had a little women's group where we got together on like Sundays sometimes to talk about scholarship and be supportive of each other. There were some men on the faculty who were very, very supportive of me and really wanted me to do well. Paul Barron, who may have recently retired, was one of those people. I remember I was writing a piece that was eventually published in NYU Law Review, obviously a good placement for one of my first pieces, and Paul was talking to me about it, and he goes, you should really present that piece to the faculty. I said, oh no, I don't want anyone to know what I'm writing about. He said, well no, actually they're gonna figure that out when you go for tenure, you should probably present it before then. So he really, I think, did a lot to make people feel more comfortable with me, and I really appreciate that. That was, very helpful. But there were other currents, and I remember my first meeting with the Promotion and Tenure Committee, they handed me a list of 20 journals. So this was before, we had these lists of journals. They handed me this list of 20 journals, and they said, this is where we want you to publish. And I look at the list. I said, well, none of them have published anything in feminist theory. And they just looked at me like, oh, that's not our problem. But I was very fortunate, in that the mainline journal started to publish feminist theory. Although I remember one of my articles, I sent it to the mainline journals, right, because I was told to. And I sent it to the California Law Review, which is, of course, at Berkeley Law School. And I get a letter back. In those days, people communicated by letter. I get a letter back saying that we have transferred your article to the Berkeley Women's Law Journal for their consideration. And I wrote them back and said, well, no, I understand there was a Berkeley Women's Law Journal. I was hoping that you would publish it. And obviously they didn't, but a couple years later they did publish a piece of mine. And so I was fortunate in that when I joined the Academy, the mainline law reviews were starting to publish feminist theory. And so I was able to be successful quite quickly. I think if I entered the academy 2 or 3 years earlier, I think it would have been much more difficult to be successful as an academic. In the traditional definition of success. Right. Right.
And what brought you to Pittsburgh after that?
Well, so while I was at Tulane, I did 2 stints at the University of Toronto where I met a man who became my husband, and we moved back down to New Orleans together, and I had a child with him, and I should say we got married because there's no other way we could both live in the same country. I'm actually anti-marriage, we can talk about later. But I compromised my beliefs because immigration it can cause compromises of beliefs. So anyway, so we got married, we had a child together, and he wanted to do become a physician's assistant at Duke. We were going to be in different cities, so my family lived in Pittsburgh, so I approached the dean at the University of Pittsburgh and asked if they might consider hiring me because I thought I was going to be raising my child largely by myself, and I wanted to have my family nearby. So they were thrilled to have someone like me, I guess, asked to join their faculty. So they agreed to hire me, and then it turned out my husband didn't go to the Duke program, but I was very happy to be in Pittsburgh. I didn't really want to raise my daughter in New Orleans. I thought that wasn't a good fit in terms of the kind of values that I wanted her to have. So I was happy to move back up to Pittsburgh.
So were you able to spend time with your family then while you were in Pittsburgh?
Yeah, I was able to. We would tend to go over there on Sunday nights for dinner, and it was nice for my daughter to get to know her grandparents. Sure. And I have a brother who still lives in Pittsburgh also, and I had my second child when I lived there as well. So it was, you never can go home, but it was still pleasant to, and my parents were so thrilled that I was married and I had a kid, and they never thought that would happen, and they didn't have to be so embarrassed about me, and they didn't have to hide my picture in the family pictures. So, I could be in the family pictures with my partner now, so I'm sure they were just thrilled.
So, but you left there?
I did. I was 9 months pregnant with my son, who was born in 1997. It was December. I gave birth in January, and I had finished my teaching for the semester. I was going to take the next semester off as maternity leave. I learned my lesson from the first birth that I should actually ask to have the entire semester off. So I had successfully lobbied for that. There, of course, was no formal policies at that time. So I'm home on maternity leave, and in those days we had voicemail, but not email. So I would periodically call my office machine to see if there were any messages. And so I listened to messages one day, and I thought, I've already heard those, and I erase it. And then I hear the next message go, oh, that's a new one. I guess I erased one I haven't listened to. I thought, well, they'll call back. So I called for messages again in a few days, and there's a message from Debbie Merritt, who is on the Ohio State faculty, and she says, Ruth, I knew her vaguely from college. Ruth, about a week or so ago, the chair of the appointments committee called you to ask if you would be considered for a chair that we have at Ohio State, and we really appreciate if you would get back to us. Like, okay. Guess that wasn't a good message to erase. So I called back pretty immediately and apologized, obviously, quite profusely. And they say, well, we have this chair, and it's the way we do chair searches is non-competitive, so we find someone we want, we bring them in, and we have this two-headed test, which is unless you have two heads, you'll get hired. You just have to show up and be reasonable. There's a presumption you'll be hired. We've already vetted you. I didn't even know they were doing this, but we'll hire. They said, we wonder if you could come in early January. I said, well, I'm due to give birth then, so probably not. And I was almost 41 at the time. So oh, okay, well, when could you come in? And I said, well, how about if I come in at the end of January? Because I think at that time I had a C-section scheduled or something, so I knew I was going to give birth. So they said, fine. So 3 weeks after I gave birth by C-section, I traveled to Columbus with my husband and my infant, who I'm breastfeeding, and leave my daughter behind with my parents to interview for a faculty position where we have breaks every 2 hours so I could nurse. And I was supposed to stay for a couple days to look at housing, and after a day, I said, I have to go home. I gave a talk in a fog. I never prepared for it. I have no idea what I said. I can't imagine it was coherent. I hadn't slept, in 3 weeks, plus you're physically uncomfortable from a C-section. So So anyway, we go home, and I was like, okay, well, there's no way we're moving. There's no way I'm going to accept this offer if they still even make it after I must have been a complete idiot. But I loved it. I really loved who I met, and it seemed like a great opportunity. And I used to talk to my mother-in-law on the phone from Canada every Sunday, and I'm talking to her after I get back, and I said, oh, it was great, but there's no way we can move. And she goes, well, why not? I said, oh, it'd just be so unfair to the family. And so she says, well, put Ed on the phone, my former husband. And so she puts Ed on the phone. She says, I think Ruth really wants to do this. Maybe you should help make this happen. So he actually didn't like Pittsburgh, so he was happy to see that I would rather move to Columbus. So I think the dean at Ohio State was shocked when I called and said, okay, I know you all think that I'm going to turn down the offer, but actually if you still want to make it, I'm inclined to accept it. So I did, and it was a great decision.
Now your life at Ohio State, what's that been? And then we'll go back and talk about your scholarship and other things.
Ohio State for me has just been a great home. I've been there for 17 years. I've never lived anywhere that long. It's been very supportive of my scholarship. It's been able to give me some funding to do some empirical work. There's a big focus in interdisciplinary work, so I've been able to work with some people from other departments. I've moved into doing a lot of work in special education, and there's a very strong disability group at Ohio State, and in my special education class, I have some students from Allied Health who tend to enroll in the class, who add a lot to the class dynamic. So I've fortunately had a lot of opportunities to leave, and I haven't left in part because of the children. You know, it's hard to move children, but I also haven't moved because I love teaching students at a public university. I've never understood why I should want to teach students at necessarily the best law school, because it seems to me that the students at every law school are entitled to a great education, and if I can help do that, I'm thrilled to do that. And they have the resources to support my scholarship. The teaching load is very reasonable. The dean has usually been very supportive of the kind of work I want to do. My current dean, Alan Michael's theme is something like, we make a difference, you know, and I hope I make a difference in many ways. So I've been very happy there. I assume I'll retire at Ohio State.
How have things changed for women students at your school over the time that you've been there? Have they been about the same?
You know, I would say the gay rights issues is what's really changed much more than the gender issues. You know, we've always aspired to have 50% women. We usually don't succeed in the Midwest. It's harder to recruit women to attend law school. Occasionally we're thrilled when we get over 50% women. We've been very proactive in trying to hire female faculty. The faculty certainly has more women on it than it did when I joined, but they already had quite a few women when I joined. We had a woman dean for many years, Nancy Rogers. I have always felt very respected as one of the senior members of the faculty. I think that at Ohio State it's been very different for me than my other two teaching stints. I think because I came in with a chair, so I came in with some respect. So I have always felt very respected and valued for who I am and what I do. You know, I haven't had to try to worry about being someone else. And I've been with a male partner the whole time I've been at Ohio State. And maybe that's made it easier, you know, in terms of the perceptions of who I am. But it's been a very positive environment for me. And you know, occasionally, sure, the women band together and argue that we didn't hire any women for a couple of years, and we try to push, you know, to have that happen. But I think generally there's sort of a consensus about that, yes, that's important.
Have you had sort of work-life balance issues since you've been at Ohio State? Do you have a couple kids?
Yeah, I have a couple kids, and I was divorced a while ago, and you know, so I've had a lot of responsibilities in terms of child rearing. Sure, you know, I've always been fortunate in that I work really quickly and efficiently, I think. I often work a lot at home. I've always had a very flexible work schedule. My daughter swam competitively, and I don't think I ever missed a swim meet. You know, and even when she was in college, we tried to get up there as much as I could. She was up at Wesleyan, so that was pretty far away from Columbus, Ohio. But I've always tried to make sure that I could attend the events in my children's schools that were important to them. My son had some disability issues from a young age, and I've been very active, you know, in his education as well. So I've always put my children first, but I wrote my first book when I was on maternity leave with my daughter. So I think for whatever reason, I'm able to, when you give me 20 minutes, in 20 minutes I can get something done. And it doesn't take me a lot of time to get started. I think some people, it takes them the 20 minutes to warm up and then the kid's crying and there goes your 20 minutes. I don't sleep much. That probably has always helped. So I've always had a great work-life balance, but probably that's because, you know, I think in some ways being single was easier because I wasn't going out than I didn't have an active social life. And so I had more time for the children, and I would look forward to going to my daughter's swim meets to see other adults and stuff like that. I remember one of my colleagues, Martha Shamala, said to me a long time ago, well, you know, you have to realize when you have a child, so you have about a decade when you can't do all the things that everybody else does. But she had one child, and I had two, and my two are 5 years apart and 7 years apart in school. And so for me, it's really been 20 years. And so that's just normal for me that I stopped feeling guilty. Well, I sort of have stopped feeling guilty about it, things I just don't do. I don't go to the weekend recruiting, you know, things that we have for incoming students. I don't go to the evening activities. I try to avoid going to late meetings. I just have always done that. And if I'm the chair of the committee, I get to schedule when the meetings are, so that's good. So I've always been good, I think, to say no. I think the hardest thing for me has been traveling. Now I can travel quite a bit. It's not as difficult, but when the kids were younger, it was very hard for me to travel and to go to the conferences and to say yes for the exciting invitations I would have to speak and stuff. And I think that's true for a lot of women who have a lot of childcare responsibilities, and that's been my experience.
Did you get involved in disability issues because of your son, or was that predated?
I got involved in disability issues through my gay rights work because I was in New Orleans in the 1980s during the AIDS crisis, and so I started representing men who were perceived to be HIV positive or facing discrimination at the workplace before we had a disability law. And we had to use the state disability statute or Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. We didn't have an ADA yet, and so I settled some of those cases, but I also lost one of those cases in the Fifth Circuit. Not me personally, I was in a team of people, but we collectively lost the case. It's an ACLU case. And so AIDS work got me into disability work. And then my good friend Chai Feldblum helped draft the ADA and get it through Congress. And so we started talking about my AIDS cases that I was having trouble with. And so we made sure some language got added to the ADA that would help the particular problem I was facing. So then when I left Tulane to go to the University of Pittsburgh, the dean said to me, what would you like to teach? And one of the things I said was disability law. And he goes, oh, great. And then, of course, there were no course materials, and then I really got much more involved in the topic when I decided to actually teach it. But it was actually through gay rights to the AIDS crisis that I got into disability. And then when my son was diagnosed as having disabilities when he was 3, I started to get more involved in special education issues. Mm-hmm. And he's 17 now. Mm-hmm. So that's where that activism came from.
Stop a sec. Your pro bono and your community work, some things that stand out to you as important? Oh, I mean, I just love that work. If I could do that full time, you know, I didn't have to have this day job to make a living, I would love to. Right now, a really, really satisfying piece of work I'm doing is on this panel, which is called a Best Practices panel, to create new rules for the Law School Admissions Council deciding whether students get accommodations on the LSAT. And our report's going to come out at the end of January, and I don't know exactly what the ending of the story will be, but my hope, and I guess we can see if this happens, is that, you know, our work is transformative in terms of how a testing entity considers applications from people with disabilities. If we're successful in our work, there will be people out there, you know, who have an opportunity to have extra time and they take the LSAT, who I can then teach.
I love teaching students who've gotten accommodations on the LSAT. They are usually so conscientious and wonderful students, and the idea that they don't get to be in my class because of this examination, which they found to be not testing their knowledge and aptitude and skills and abilities. So I'll benefit because I'll get to teach them, but hopefully they'll benefit because they'll get to attend law school. So I'm looking forward to that. I do a lot of pro bono work in the special education field, and you know, to see these kids now maybe have a chance to learn in school, you know, is really important to me. It's also frustrating because I only represent 5 or 6 kids a year, and there's millions out there that need help. But you know, it's nice to go to sleep at night and say I did a good deed today. I feel good about myself, and so you know, it's trite that I get more out of this than I give, right? We all say that, but it is so true. Hopefully I don't do it for what I get, I do it for what I give, but I do receive a lot by knowing that my work can really affect people out there. That's why I went to law school, was to save the world. I haven't saved the whole world, but you know, a few pieces of it I've been able to help with.
Any big disappointments?
Well, the abortion rights struggle is just a huge, huge disappointment. My first couple of books were on the abortion issue, and I did some work when I lived in Louisiana against Operation Rescue, trying to destroy abortion clinics, and some work in Mississippi about the 48-hour waiting period rules there and how that was destructive of women's opportunities to have abortions. And you know, there's just been retrenchment and further retrenchment. I'm on the board of the National ACLU. It's a very important issue, obviously, for the ACLU as an organization. And you know, people are so excited about the gay rights movement and the progress in marriage equality. And although I'm anti-marriage, that's a little hard for me, but I understand the importance of that issue. But at the same time, as we've had all these advances in marriage equality, we've had equal retrenchment in abortion rights. And so I'm very discouraged, you know, by that. And I think that there's been a lot of backlash against the women's rights movement. So we've made advances, and there have been a lot of changes, but not for all women. And so it's not my area of primary activism now. Probably, maybe it should be. Maybe if I was more involved in those issues, we wouldn't be seeing so much retrenchment. But that's a real disappointment to me. And looking back on the issues I've dealt with in my life, that we've gone nowhere there.
No. Okay. Let's talk again a little bit about the impact of your scholarship. What do you think it's meant to people?
Well, you know, you don't know what it's meant until someone tells you. And so occasionally people tell me, and I really appreciate that. So yesterday I was speaking on a panel about disability discrimination with Kai Feldblum, who helped write the Americans with Disabilities Act, and Senator Harkin was one of the speakers, and she introduced me to Senator Harkin and told him how some of my scholarship had been used during the legislative process, and I didn't even know that. Kai never mentioned it to me. You wouldn't know that from reading the legislative record, which I have read. And so the idea that I could have helped be a piece of a statute being amended is a pretty exciting thought. I get emails from parents who read my disabled education book and tell me how much they identify with the book and how important it's been to them. I really appreciate that. I wrote a book on bisexuality, and I occasionally get drafts of manuscripts from young scholars who are writing about bisexuality, and my book was sort of the first major piece on that subject, and they'll build on my work, and it's great to feel that my work is important enough that someone would still want to rely on it and build on it. So one of the exciting things for me is that I've done a lot of different kinds of work in my life. I've done feminist theory and gay rights and disability and special ed. In each one of those arenas, I will hear from people sometimes that even today, you know, some of my earlier work is helpful to them, or maybe even help them effectuate change as in the legislative process. So
it sounds like the genres are a little bit different too. Is that right? That some's more narrative, some's more empirical. Am I right about that?
Yeah, that's right. I've done narrative, empirical, theoretical, sort of case law, probably not so much case law stuff. Yeah, I've done a lot of different kinds of work in my life. And one of the things about my scholarship is I've always written to myself. I've never really thought about my audience. I've always just written what I wanted to say. And so I'm always surprised when people tell me they read something I wrote, because I forget that when it's published, someone might read it, other than maybe your parents or something. And so it's exciting to think that your scholarship does matter. And so it's been fun to hear from some people sometimes that my scholarship has made a difference.
Just one more question. What's ahead for you in terms of scholarship? What is on the drawing board for the next 5 or 10 years?
Well, these days my work is really nitty-gritty. This summer I'm going to read 1,400 hearing officer decisions and special education cases because I like getting down in the weeds. I think this is my math background and just finding out what's going on there in the real world. I remember one time I was at a talk by a professor at University of Texas who's very distinguished in his field, in the labor law field, and he said, you know, it's funny, the more I know, the less law reviews are interested in publishing my work. And I think that that's true. When I would write broad theoretical stuff and I didn't have much experience in the real world, oh, everyone wanted to publish my stuff. Now I'm actually out there in the weeds and the thickets, really finding out what happens in a very concrete way. That's much harder to publish. But, you know, I like to study this stuff because I find it interesting. And so these days my work is much more concrete and practical, I think, than it was in the earlier stages of my career.
Any things that I haven't asked you about that you'd like to talk about?
No, I mean, I would just say to anyone who's a young person who might someday, you know, watch this interview that I just hope you follow your passions and don't just do things because people say it's the right thing to do, that you set your own compass and that's the way to have success. You obviously need to be moral and ethical, but this sort of careerism, instrumentalism, it's just not the way, at least I think, to have a satisfying life. So I'm really appreciative of the opportunities I've had and the mindset that I've had to just not care what other people think sometimes. I think that's a really important mindset.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for participating.